Oh, fuck! Whoa, holy...
The coolest thing about my job is definitely blowing stuff up.
It's like a wave of energy just rolling over you.
Former Commando Paul Dunbaven will never forget the sensation of a blast wave moving through his body.
Depending on the volume of the energy, is whether you might lose consciousness, you might come to. Firing anti-tank weapons, you might have a metallic taste in your mouth. You get paid to take risks, and that could include losing your life, but that's what people join the Defence Force for.
For more than 3 decades, he served in the Special Forces, becoming Command Sergeant Major of Australia's Special Operations Command in 2015.
I've been exposed to blast for my whole military career, but in Special Forces, it's the nature of the work. Domestic counter-terrorism, you've got to be able to gain entry into a building that will require explosive and effect, and yeah, you'll be exposed to overpressure.
Paul was deployed around the world, serving in Afghanistan, Iraq and East Timor. But it's the repeated blasts during hundreds of training exercises at home that he thinks had a lasting impact on his brain.
I think for myself, and I realised, I'm a demolition supervisor, running, organising demolition charges on a range for a number of weeks. We were exposed to blast over and over again during different training serials.
When a weapon is fired, it creates an explosion that produces a wave of energy. It's a high-pressure pulse which passes through the whole body, including the brain. The effects of high-level blast exposure are more obvious, but scientists have now found repeated exposures to blasts, even at lower levels, could lead to mild traumatic brain injury, or MTBI.
Well, MTBI is a term that has come into being to try and address this issue of repeated exposures of individuals to potential head trauma, which doesn't necessarily cause concussion. The concern is, and this is partly arisen out of the interest of head injury in the sporting domain, that it's recognised that the repeated exposures to these less severe forms of head trauma have the potential for long-term consequences in terms of cognitive functioning.
In the United States, Professor Anne McKee has studied the brains of hundreds of veterans exposed to blast and found some have a different form of brain injury to sports people.
In military veterans, of course, they're exposed to not just concussive hits or injuries through falls or impacts, but they're exposed to blast. And that injury is quite different. It is a penetrating blast wave that goes through the skull and injures and moves the tissue and injures the brain in a different way than a concussive impact occurs.
She's among the US researchers who have identified new types of brain injury linked to repeated low-level blast.
So the most common symptoms are irritability, impulsivity, depression, mood changes. They can be quite depressed and feel hopeless and suicidal in some cases. They can feel that their sleep is disturbed, that they are more aggressive, more prone to violence. You can have memory changes, difficulty thinking, difficulty with attention, and it can be quite disabling.
2 years after he was promoted, Paul Dunbaven's short-term memory deteriorated.
Yeah, I started to notice probably about 2017. I was just getting, like, it was a forgetfulness. Do you want to put some hair on? My short-term memory, I could feel it failing. I could feel like, my wife started to notice, she would say, hey, what are you doing?
Wife Nicole saw his personality change too.
So he's gone from happy-go-lucky to very relaxed to quite a serious person, you know, and quite short-tempered with the kids in particular.
I would go, I'd have bursts of anger. I've got teenage boys. I would go from 0 to 1,000 degrees with the boys.
And what's that been like for you to watch?
Yeah, it's been pretty tough, and just getting the kids to understand what's going on, because sometimes he does react in a way that he normally wouldn't, and just having to explain to the kids this is what's going on and this is why it's happening.
At around the time Paul Dunbaven started noticing symptoms, one of his good friends and Special Forces instructors, Sergeant Peter Caife, was struggling too.
Pete was an explosives and method of entry expert, which meant he was really good at blowing things up and of breaching doors and entryways and things that they needed to get into. He would have put someone like Paul Dunbaven through his training course. He would have been there all day, every day, for so many of those charges, unlike everyone else who would rotate through that for safety reasons. Look, Pete was magnetic. He was fun, caring, loving. But there was always stress, there was always anxiety around the job, the work. They're really high functioning until they aren't. Actually, he had headaches all the time, significant and so bad that I think that was probably why he just disconnected.
As well as constant headaches, Peter Caife also had ringing in his ears, memory loss and a short temper.
We knew that something was wrong with his cognition. There were moments where he would express fear around what was going on in his brain and concern. And we would talk about some of the research that was happening in the US and other things.
There's no question that veterans have been suffering from these injuries for hundreds of years. Even the shell shock that people talk about with World War I. They don't have a poor constitution or an inability to manage stress. It's an actual injury to the brain, causing the brain to malfunction.
Towards the end of his life, Peter Caife grew angry, paranoid, and would lash out at his wife and the children he loved so much. He was also recovering from a stroke and had a complicated history of trauma.
He was a child of trauma. He inflicted trauma. He was both a victim and a perpetrator of family and domestic violence. He was short with me and short with the kids, and got several times, and it was unlike him to yell at the little ones and get really impatient, really angry, leave the house, just totally disengaged from all of us. So he saw his career ending and was losing purpose and self-worth, and so his confidence was going. And so there were all these things happening for him. After one episode of him being really impatient with the kids, I asked him to get help, to help with emotional regulation and getting perspective on where he was and what might be happening with his career. And he got violent with me, and I left with the kids. And that was on a Friday, and Monday he died by suicide.
It's impossible to know if Peter Caife's history of blast exposure contributed to his death, but Gwen Cherney believes it did.
I believe there is no way that you can do the jobs he did in the military and overseas, have the expertise that he had, be exposed to it so often, and not have any impact on your brain.
It's very difficult to come to conclusions linking any particular exposure or injury with suicide. I can say broadly that trauma to the brain increases your risk for suicide, and that trauma can be very severe trauma, it can be mild trauma, it can be blast trauma. You have an increased risk.
I wish in that moment I had had clarity to say, someone needs his brain. We need to see what's in it, what's going on, and actually analyze it and help other people. There's so many times where I wish I could go back and just do that one thing.
Diagnosing mild traumatic brain injury from blasts is difficult because the symptoms overlap with a number of other mental health conditions.
Every brain in its own way tells a different story. Every brain is beautiful and unique in its own way.
The only way to fully understand the damage blasts can cause is by dissecting the brain after death. Australia's only Veterans Brain Bank has had only one veteran's brain donated so far.
We need to be able to retrieve brains from across the country in a timely way to make sure that they are most valuable for research. And then we need people. We need as many people, as many veterans as possible to sign up and pledge to donate their brain. Just by signing up, you're actually going to make sure you're looking after the next generation of veterans.
I remember having a conversation with Paul maybe 6 months after Pete died. He said, so when is this going to happen to me? Like, how much longer do I have until I hit breaking point?
Paul Dunbaven has pledged his brain to the Veterans Brain Bank to be studied after his death. But he's also having testing and treatment with neurologist Dr. Rowena Mobbs.
Can you remember my 3 words? Lemon, key and bicycle.
2 minutes later, he's asked to repeat the words.
Lemon. No, that's it. Don't know.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. It was a struggle.
Yeah.
Today, he's getting brain scan results too.
Firstly, we'll start with your PET scan, the uptake of sugar, the metabolic picture of your brain.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that really struck us here was an area called the prefrontal cortex was very low for you. So that to me really suggested that, oh boy, there could be something going on here.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Mobbs believes Paul likely has a type of brain injury similar to that caused by repeated concussions, but damage from low-level blast exposure can't be confirmed while he's still alive.
But blast damage we cannot know for sure unless we looked under the microscope pathologically after death.
We did a process, it's called Plan Cerebro, and we did have blast gauges for about 18 months during Afghanistan. But where that data went, I'm not too sure.
12 years ago, Paul was one of thousands of Australian soldiers in Afghanistan fitted with gauges to measure blast exposure.
Once we start being able to gather that info on how much exposure have you had, then you can actually start regulating. You need to step back and have a rest, and we'll come back next week.
The project was codenamed Cerebro. It found personnel were exposed to potentially harmful blast effects. It recommended further research and that the gauges continue to be used. The ADF said at that time the technology was not fully matured and more research was needed. We've discovered there was a second blast gauge trial carried out in 2016 during this training exercise known as Chongju.
Right hand side of commanders, hill 1 round javelin. Go on.
A report provided to Defence again found there was a notable risk to soldiers from blast exposure, especially in training. But it would be years before another trial was conducted.
Well, I think this speaks to the problem. I think, unfortunately, often the need to do these studies is understood. There are individuals who will conduct and carry out the research, but there aren't the senior leaders who then pick up the mantle and ensure that the next stage of work is done. I think some important balls have been dropped.
The ADF declined to be interviewed, but said in a statement it takes workplace safety and hazards seriously and has been involved in research related to blast exposure for more than a decade. A defence spokesperson said another study monitoring low-level blast exposure in training was started 2 months ago, and that it published updated guidance last year to include measures to minimise blast exposure where possible. This month, the US Deputy Defence Secretary went much further.
The Pentagon is taking new steps to protect the brain health of troops.
Senior defence officials were directed to take immediate action to limit exposure to blast in training to minimise the risk of brain injury through protective equipment, reducing exposure and monitoring impacts through cognitive testing. Australian veterans and their families want more action here too.
I think there's ways we can mitigate it. My personal opinion, we can, if I'd known what I know now, we could have probably done things a little bit different, but we didn't.
Gwen Cherney is now the first Commissioner for Veteran Families working with the DVA.
We are just walking around saying there's not enough evidence. That response is no longer good enough. Do we need the knowledge and the research and the data to do a better job of caring for? We have a moral obligation to do so. And why we aren't doing that, we need to now.